Demonology in the Old Testament. Most Christians generally deal with this subject of demonology, the devil, evil spirits, and deliverance from only the New Testament standpoint. It never seems to occur to them that the Old Testament is filled with teaching on demonology. In fact, more than the New, because the New assumes you know something about it. And Jesus comes along, tells his disciples, go cast out demons. He doesn't give them a course in demonology that you're going to get. So the Old Testament is filled with the subject. Like everything else, this is where we have to go to get the understanding of the New. First of all, we see this because Israel was quite knowledgeable on the subject. Israel was quite knowledgeable on the subject of demonology. Now, she should have been, because the apostate Israelites in Egypt, in the wilderness wanderings, and in the later kingdom period, the apostate Israelites actually worshipped demons, and they knew they were worshiping demons. Just as those involved in witchcraft today know they're worshiping the devil. That's their god. And they know that. They worship these dark powers. So Israel was aware of that. Deuteronomy 32, 16 and 17, with 1 Corinthians 10, 20. Deuteronomy 32, 16 and 17, with 1 Corinthians 10, 20. Did you know that? Are you aware? You don't have to answer it. It's just a rhetorical question that Israel in Egypt, in the wilderness wanderings, and later in the kingdom period, the apostate Israelites worshiped demons. Deuteronomy 32, 16 and 17. This is right before they go into the land. They provoked him, Moses said, to jealousy with strange gods. With abominations provoked they him to anger. They sacrificed to demons. King James devils, but this is the word demon. They sacrificed unto demons, not to God. To gods whom they knew not, to new gods that came newly up, whom your fathers feared not. They picked up demon worship in Egypt. And now if you look at 1 Corinthians 10, 20, you see that Paul, a Jew, is knowledgeable about this, that people actually have and do worship demons. 1 Corinthians 10:20. But I say that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I would not that you should have fellowship with demons. So Israel should have been knowledgeable on the subject. She worshipped them. And remember, most of the Israelites perished in the wilderness. There's another passage, Acts 7, Stephen's address, where he speaks of them carrying the images of their gods out of Egypt with them. Secondly, evil spirits and their activities are mentioned in many passages in the Old Testament. Evil spirits and their activities are mentioned in many passages. We're saying the Old Testament is filled with teaching on the subject. And the New Testament simply assumes you know about what the Old Testament said. Now we'll look at most of the passages because that's the way you learn that the subject fills the Old Testament. For example, lying spirits mentioned 1 Kings 22, 20 to 23. 1 Kings 22, 20 to 23. So we'll look up the passages so you can get the context and see how much the subject is dealt with in the Old Testament. Because a lot of these passages, if you don't look them up, then when you do run across them sometime, you won't know to apply that to the subject of demonology. It'll just kind of pass you by as not significant. 22, 20 to 23. This is the case of the prophet Micaiah. He's telling a vision he had. The Lord said, who shall persuade Ahab that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? And one said on this manner, and one said on another manner. And there came forth a spirit, and stood before the Lord, and said, I will persuade him. And the Lord said unto him, wherewith? And he said, I will go forth, and I will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all of his prophets. And he said, thou shalt persuade him, and prevail also. Go forth and do so. Now, if you put that with Job 1 and 2, you'll see that God is in sovereign control of even the activities of the kingdom of Satan. And so a lying spirit had to get his permission to do it, but that's what we're told there, a lying spirit. Then oppressing spirits are seen, oppressing spirits, you've heard of those, are seen in 1 Samuel 16, 14 to 16. Oppressing spirits. This is the case of King Saul, who was disobedient, and God took the Holy Spirit from him and sent an oppressing, a troubling spirit. 1 Kings 16, 14 to 16. But the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. And Saul's servants said unto him, Behold, an evil spirit from God troubleth thee. And let our Lord now command thy servants which are before thee to seek out a man who is a cunning player on the harp. And it shall come to pass, when the evil spirit from God is upon thee, he shall play with his hand, and thou shalt be well. Then in verse 23, And it came to pass, when the evil spirit from God was upon Saul, that David took the harp. He was a skilled harpist, and played with his hand. So Saul was refreshed and well, and the evil spirit departed from him. I'll give you one guess as to why. Well, I know you know why, but I like to say it anyway. Same reason that when we sing and praise the Lord, evil spirits are bound and have to depart. They'll do one or the other. They can't stay around people praising the Lord. In 1 Samuel 18:10, we see it continued, where the evil spirit, troubling spirit, came upon Saul. Then in 19 verse 9 again. So that was an oppressing spirit. And then we see mention in the Old Testament of occult contact with spirits. That's Deuteronomy 18. Occult contact with all sorts of spirits. Deuteronomy 18, 9 and following. When thou art come to the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, thou shalt not learn to do after the abominations of those nations. There shall not be found among you anyone that maketh his son or daughter to pass through the fire, that uses divination, or is an observer of the times, an enchanter, a witch, a charmer, a consulter with familiar spirits, a wizard, a necromancer. All that do these things are an abomination unto the Lord, and because of these abominations the Lord thy God doth drive them out from before thee. Thou shalt be perfect with the Lord thy God. So there, of course, is a familiar passage to most of us here, but it deals with the whole range of the occult, and we'll deal with that passage specifically later. Then we see the sacrifice to and worship of demons set forth. Sacrifice to and worship of demons. We've given you Deuteronomy 32, 16 and 17, which you can write down. Deuteronomy 32, 16 and 17. We've already looked at that. Another passage, Leviticus 17:7. Sacrifice to and the worship of demons. Leviticus 17:7. And they shall no more offer their sacrifices unto demons, after whom they've gone a-whoring, and this shall be a statute forever unto them throughout their generations. They shall no more offer their sacrifices to demons. Very clearly stated there, they did. Psalm 106:37 says the same thing. They sacrificed to demons. In fact, there are 3 passages in the Old Testament stating that very fact. And this is the third one, Psalm 106:37. Verse 36, they served idols, which were a snare to them. Yea, they sacrificed their sons and their daughters unto demons. Actually, human sacrifice offered to demons. And that's quite prevalent in black witchcraft even today. Animal as well as human sacrifice. Those who are knowledgeable in occult studies, I mean with respect to opposing it, know that they're constantly finding animals, dogs, and cats. One section in California, in like 6 months period, they found over 100 dogs and cats. Nothing wrong with them, just no blood in them. So the blood was used in animal sacrifice. Then, of course, the ones who were missing, they didn't turn up, but they used the animals for all sorts of foul worship. Without going into detail, it's pretty vile. And then sometimes a human sacrifice. A number of people have been murdered, and they know, they've said, the authorities, that it's a result of Satanism, Satan worship. So Psalm 106:37 is the same spirit that's motivating the witches' covens, or covens if you prefer, either way is correct, and the black sabbats and Satan worship. Sometimes I get letters, people hear the tapes or read the literature who are mixed up in that, and they'll try to correct you. They'll say, well, there's a lot of good witchcraft, white magic and all. So we know it's all the same source. If Satan is going to deceive, if he can't deceive with black magic, he'll do it with white, Or black witchcraft, he'll do it with white. And the black witchcraft, of course, is the type that's always pronouncing curses, and the white's supposed to be doing good for people, in case you don't know the difference between the devil. It ends up and they get hurt anyway. So we know that not all witches coven, sacrifice animals, and not all have their sex orgies after. The third rite in any meeting is to have that, where they actually act it out, literally. But in some of the covens, they skip the third part of the ceremony. And in others, the high priest and high priestess act it out before the group that's there. Well, maybe you haven't read too much in present-day occultism. It's no different than all through history from back in Babylon. And I don't suggest you do read it. The habitations of demons are mentioned. We'll be looking at this later, so we won't look up the passages now. The habitations of demons, Isaiah 13:21 and 34:14. Isaiah 13:21 and 34:14. We'll be looking at that a little later. But it's interesting there. Again, if you don't know your Old Testament, you don't get the significance of what Jesus meant in Matthew 12 when he says the demons, when they leave a man, walk about in dry places, deserts. And if you know the Old Testament passages, you can see he simply knew his Old Testament had reference to that, because they have certain habitations, and one of them is in the dry places. Then consulting the dead through a medium, in 1 Samuel 28, the case of King Saul, who sought the spirit of Samuel. And I'm sure everyone's familiar with 1 Samuel 28. And that's a long chapter, and we won't read that now, maybe later in another connection. Consulting the dead through mediums, 1 Samuel 28, which, of course, all of this is condemned in Scripture. Occultism is severely punished in the Old Testament. Several passages show the punishment of those engaged in any way in the occult, witchcraft, sorcery. I'll give you the passages and then we can look at them. Exodus 22:18. Leviticus 19:26 and verse 31. 1 Chronicles 10:13 and following. In Leviticus 20 and verse 6. All right, now this speaks of the attitude of God toward occultism. You find occultism even in the church today, all sorts, ways and forms of it. Read our book, Every Wind of Doctrine, or Angels of Light, and you'll see that it's quite prevalent. And so-called innocent ways like the Ouija board and so forth. But here's God's attitude, Exodus 22:18. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Leviticus 19 and 20 are two other passages that give God's attitude toward occult involvement in the Old Testament. In fact, if you were caught in these things in the Old Testament, this would have been your judgment. Leviticus 19:26. You shall not eat anything with the blood, neither use enchantment, nor observe times. Verse 31. Regard not them that have familiar spirits, neither seek after wizards, to be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God. Notice here, you're defiled by occultism. Why? Because Satan is a defiling spirit, an unclean spirit. And he's the god behind the Ouija board, fortune tellers, hypnosis, palm reading, seances, you name it. 20 verse 6. And the soul that turneth after such as have familiar spirits, and after wizards, to go a-whoring after them, I will even set my face against that soul, and will cut him off from among his people. That's God's attitude. 1 Chronicles 10:13 is quite interesting. Take that with 1 Samuel 28. Keep that in mind. That's what it's talking about. Where King Saul consulted the medium, spiritus medium. It was a seance to bring up Samuel. In 1 Chronicles 10, 13, and 14. So Saul died for his transgression, which he committed against the Lord, even against the word of the Lord, which he kept not, and also for asking counsel of one that had a familiar spirit to inquire of it, and inquired not of the Lord. Therefore he slew him, and turned the kingdom unto David, the son of Jesse. God tells us here he slew Saul because he consulted a medium. And you know, Christians, they somehow have this institutional religious mentality that I'm under grace, and they think they can sin with impunity. That's an abomination, Deuteronomy 18, to consult with other spirits. And that's what you're doing, of course. Thirdly, in a real sense, we should keep in mind the Old Testament dispensation continues to the cross. That'll help you understand what else we'll say. In a real sense, the Old Testament dispensation continues to the cross. Because remember, they didn't even have a New Testament until 20 years after the resurrection, ascension. Now, I say that to say that certain passages in the New Testament before Calvary give evidence that the Jews were familiar with deliverance and the need of deliverance and exorcism. Let's look at a few passages. Matthew 12, 24 to 27. By his statement here, he shows, by the way, his statement without explanation, he shows that the Jews were accustomed to casting out demons. Matthew 12, 24 to 27. They accuse him here, Jesus, of doing his work by the spirit of Beelzebub. This fellow doth cast out devils, but by Beelzebub, the prince of devils. They said Jesus cast out demons by the power of the devil. And Jesus knew their thoughts and said unto them, every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation, and every city or house divided against itself shall not stand. And if Satan cast out Satan, he is divided against himself. How shall then his kingdom stand? And if I by Beelzebub cast out demons, now here's the statement, by whom do your children cast them out? Therefore they shall be your judges. Which means that exorcism was a common practice in Israel. Because they'd said, what's that? We can't do that. We don't do that. Well, sure, they were casting out spirits. That wasn't anything new to Israel. And that's seen over in Acts 19, verse 13. Acts 19, verse 13. This is a familiar account, but it shows you that there were those in Israel who had a deliverance ministry. They got out of line when they tried to use Jesus' name before they got Jesus in their heart. But verse 13, then certain of the vagabond Jews, exorcists, took upon them to call over them which had evil spirits the name of the Lord Jesus, saying, we adjure you by Jesus whom Paul preaches. And there were 7 sons of Sceva, a Jew, and chief of the priests, which did so. So there were 7 men in one family who were in the deliverance ministry. And there's nothing to suggest that they weren't effective, of course, because that's the whole implication. And in Matthew 10:8, which we won't look up, Jesus commissions the disciples to cast out demons without explanation of the reality of their existence or of their presence in people. He just says, go do it. Matthew 10:8. He commissioned the disciples, go cast out demons without any explanation as to the reality of them. Now it's significant, you see, that the New Testament written by Jews makes no theological study of the subject of demonism. Their existence is taken for granted. Like Genesis 1 doesn't try to prove the existence of God. A fool would deny the existence of God. And people who are knowledgeable, and of course the modern psychiatrists and medical science and theologians even for that matter, the greater part of them, they think they're knowledgeable, but they're really proving their ignorance, because knowledgeable people know that the ills and diseases and afflictions, the greater part of them are demon oppression, possession, and at any rate always the work of Satan. Modern science and theology informs us the Jews were unenlightened, and they thought things like insanity and epilepsy and disease, deafness and blindness were caused by unseen evil powers that they couldn't explain. But now today, of course, with all of our theological seminaries and medical institutions, we know that these things are really functional disorders and so forth. But Matthew 10:8, where Jesus told them to go cast out demons, and in Mark 1:32 and Matthew 10:1 and Luke chapter 9, where he tells them to cast out demons, proves that they weren't the unenlightened fools that many have tried to make them out to be. You need to attend a seminary. And I say this just to make a point. No, you really don't. But you need to attend a seminary when they get on demons, demonology, and Satan. These are just terms by unenlightened people to explain what they couldn't understand. And so on. But Jesus, without explanation, just said, go cast out demons. And people got better. They got delivered. They got well. Amen. So the very fact we have all these passages where they deal with demons without explanation, they're still in the Old Testament dispensation, shows that demonology, demonism and deliverance, well, they were as knowledgeable as charismatics. As soon as you get to baptism, everybody, right away. You don't have to have much teaching. Right away, you know what to do when a person's not acting right. I rebuke you, devil. Come out. Out in the name of Jesus. And you don't need much teaching till charismatics are starting that. It's because they've moved into the realm of the reality of this, and the Jews, as I say, who wrote the Bible, remember, they wrote it. They wrote it. Jews did. They were quite knowledgeable on it. A fourth thing that shows this, demonology in the Old Testament, is that many of the commands in the Mosaic Law have reference to the prohibition of former occult practices by the Israelites. Many of the commands in the Mosaic Law have reference to the prohibition of former occult practices by the Israelites. So many of these things we're showing you tonight, and like this especially, you read these passages, but it never dawns on you that something lies behind why God would forbid, for example, to boil a kid in its mother's milk. But that's a prohibition in the Mosaic Law, which doesn't mean a thing to us. But when you know that that was one kind of sacrifice made to fertility gods in the pagan religions, and you can see that that prohibition in the Mosaic Law was striking at that. And the Israelites knew that, but we don't. So many of the things in the Old Testament, when we say it's filled with teaching on demonology, it comes out like that, if you know the relationships. And then prohibitions against certain funeral practices. Prohibitions against certain funeral practices, like cutting yourself or cutting off a lock of your hair and so forth, for the dead is forbidden. And that has to do with occultism. They still do that, cut themselves and go through various pagan things. Leviticus 19, 27, 28. Prohibition against funeral practices. Leviticus 19, 27, 28. These are just empty commands unless you understand the reason for it. 19, 27, 28. You shall not round the corner of your heads. Well, he means the hair. He's not talking about the literal head, but the hair. At death, they would put a bowl on the hair and just cut all around, and that would be a type of mourning. You shall not round the corners of your heads, neither shalt thou mar the corners of thy beard. They would clip off a part of their beard, make it irregular to show their mourning. You shall not make any cutting in your flesh for the dead, nor print any marks upon you. Anyone here got a tattoo? That's the origin of it, out of paganism. In fact, I shouldn't have to tell you that. All you have to do is look at the South American, African tribes, the heathen tribes, and you'll see tattooing is right out of heathenism. But anyway, there you have it. Now that's the significance, because it's a form of occultism. It's found in the pagan heathen religions, and of course any pagan or heathen religion is occult, and it's a worship of demons and devils, you see. So anything they do, God forbid. Another thing we see is a prohibition against bestiality. Bestiality. I'll spell it for you, then explain it. Bestiality, which means cohabitation with animals. Intercourse with animals. We just have to be plain, the Bible is. Now, sex with animals is not uncommon in occultism, in witchcraft, and it still prevails today. Still prevails. Leviticus 20, 15 and 16. The prohibition against bestiality is striking at this occult practice of cohabiting with animals. Leviticus 20, 15 and 16. And if a man lie with a beast, he shall surely be put to death, and you shall slay the beast. But you see, it works the other way too. And if a woman approach unto any beast and lie down thereunto, thou shalt kill the woman and the beast. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood shall be upon them. Now you see, that's right in the middle of Mosaic law, like the rest of this. And you have to know the subject, Old Testament subject of demonology, to know when these things make applications. There are other references. As you run into them now, you'll see that, hey, wait, I see what God's saying there. That isn't just some old prohibition, because that prohibition is still applicable today. Again, those who are knowledgeable in the occult and what takes place know this is not uncommon. Not that this is a common practice, but it's not uncommon either. It's more common than you might imagine. Another one, prohibitions about eating certain foods, which are often found in close connection with the occult. If you wonder why God forbids certain foods, it's because they're used still today, by the way, in close connection with the occult. Later on, we'll deal with clean and unclean foods as such under worship, but here we'll mention a few that God forbade them to eat, and the reason is because they're close connection with the occult. Snakes. Oh, have you never heard of people eating snakes? It's a delicacy to some people. Rattlesnake meat and heathen cultures. Swine. Oh, that's why. And, bacon does taste good and all. And we have to wait till we get over to the prohibitions under worship to know why this is. We can't cover both sections at once, so we just have to leave it. You say, well then, why wouldn't it be unclean to eat pork? Well, for the same reason that the goat is unclean. It's unclean when it's used in the occult, but it's clean when it's used in Israel's worship. Well, as I say, there's no way to explain it until we get over there, because the prohibitions had either to do with just religious considerations to show Israel she was a peculiar people, or they were occult connections, or both, you see. But we'll save that for later. But anyway, at this point, snakes, swine, the stork, an unclean bird, frogs, various kinds of birds which dwell in ruins, and the ruins are habitats of demons. So prohibitions against eating certain foods, you see, sometimes occult connections. Now, again and again in occult literature, in their drawings, in their images, in apparitions and appearances, you see these things. You'll see the snake. It's always appearing in connection with the occult. I mean, actually, literally appearing. And of course, we know the Bible relates that even to the devil himself. And swine, often when people are being terrified by demons, demons take on appearances of swine. Like one woman I dealt with for deliverance, she didn't know about occult connections. She'd been involved in that, and walked in her bedroom and started to pull on the light and said that suddenly she smelled fire and brimstone, and turned around and there was an ugly green hog snorting and rooting. It was a demonic appearance, and just about scared her out of her wits. And then she came to me and wanted to know why, and then we showed her the connection. But you see the swine, the hog, appearing as a part of a demonic apparition. Frogs and crows and storks. Certain things are just related to the occult. And so because they were so widely used, that was one reason why they were forbidden to be eaten. They were considered unclean. So I say it's getting ahead of the story, but when you come to grace, remember nothing's unclean in itself. Those were religious considerations. Nothing is unclean in itself. All meat, Paul says, is cleansed by faith and prayer, thanksgiving. That still doesn't mean you have to eat snakes to prove you're free. Don't get too harsh on the bacon and the pork sausage. But that's all right because the animal is not considered unclean in itself. Now, the origin of demons. If God had wanted us to know, where do you suppose He would have told us about it? Old or New Testament? Well, I would think so. Because everything that's in the New had its start in the Old. Everything. The only exception, mentioned 3 times, we've told you this, is the church. Paul said 3 times it's a mystery. Well, if God wanted us to know the origin of demons, He would have told us, and the Old Testament would have been the place. But the Bible doesn't tell us. So we move on. But before we do, I'll give you the theories. No, God doesn't tell us, but we've got a lot of theories. First theory is the demons are fallen angels. That probably hit 50% of you if you thought about it. And that comes from the Apocrypha, the Book of Enoch, E-N-O-C-H, in the Apocrypha. Fallen angels. Well, the only problem with that is we've got fallen angels and demons in the Bible. That's one thing. Second thing is, fallen angels are doubtless of the highest order in Satan's kingdom because they're the ones that rebelled with him. They doubtless rule as his lieutenants and princes. And thirdly, we never hear of Jesus casting out a fallen angel. It's always a demon. So there must be a difference. Fallen angels are never said to possess people. Did you ever hear of an angel possessing anyone? But you do demons. Of course, if you argue demons are fallen angels, that takes care of that, but you have to prove it first. Secondly, a second theory, they are a fallen pre-Adamic race of man. God created a race that fell and they became demons, and then He created Adam. Well, you got 2 falls. Why didn't Adam become a demon? Well, don't raise those questions because you kind of rocked the boat on this theory. I don't buy any of them if you want to know my feelings. Thirdly, this is Josephus, you might like it. They are spirits, demons are spirits of the wicked dead. Well, there are a lot of appearances purporting to be deceased people. Whether or not they're demon impersonation is going to settle that view. The dead do not return, we're told. Spirits of the wicked dead, Josephus. And then the Jewish tradition, and I don't mean this as a valid Jewish tradition, the demons are the offspring of Adam and Lilith, a female demon. We'll get to Lilith. If you noticed your outline, she's on there. The offspring of Adam and Lilith. We'll say more about that later. She, in the Old Testament, is a female demon. Their sphere of existence, where are demons now? And where will they be in the future? The sphere of existence. Again, the Old Testament is helpful. But we have to refer to the New Testament on some of these things too, to get the complete picture. The sphere of existence. At present, well, several places. In the heavenly regions, one place. In the heavenly regions. That is, in Satan's kingdom. Now, we see from Leviticus 17:7 and Deuteronomy 32:17 that the worship of demons, of course, is the worship of the devil. He's called the god of this world. And so wherever the devil is, the demons, or at least some of them must be. So from Ephesians 6, they are called spirits of wickedness in the heavenlies. Not wicked spirits in high places, but spirits of wickedness in the heavenlies. And Satan is called the prince of the power of the air. So his kingdom is in the heavenlies. Not God's heaven, but the heavenly regions. That's why he's called the prince of the power of the air. Now this is an implication, of course, because we assume where he is, his armies will be, at least some of them. That's one place we know they're in the heavenly regions. They come down against the world. Secondly, we see they are at present powers behind secular governments. They're powers behind the secular governments. And that means all the governments, because they're all secular. Now, I don't imagine governments would appreciate us saying it, but it's true nevertheless. That the God of this world, Satan, in Luke chapter 4, offered the governments and kingdoms of this world to Jesus. And the devil said to Jesus, they belong to me, and to whomsoever I will, I give it. The power, the authority, the glory of these kingdoms. And it couldn't have been a real temptation if they weren't his. So that's Luke 4, but in Daniel 10, 12 to 14, we see this also. Daniel 10, 12 to 14. Now we can't teach the whole context, but here Daniel has been praying for 3 weeks without an answer about restoration of Israel. Verse 12. And an angel comes to Daniel, and he says, Fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that thou didst set thine heart to understand and to chasten thyself before thy God, thy words were heard, and I am come for thy words. Then verse 13, For the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me. Now a good angel says the prince. So the prince here, as all interpreters agree, and Jews likewise, is the satanic prince who ruled at that time over Persia. He withstood me 21 days. But lo, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, and I remained there with the king of Persia. So there we see the power of demonic spirits, and here no doubt a powerful fallen angel, who is the prince of Persia. They are over every municipality, every geographical region, nation, state, county, city, hamlet, down to the dog catcher. I mean, they're in control of everything that's not of the church. It's that simple. They're called in Ephesians 6 the rulers of the darkness of this world. They rule this world. And Satan in Luke 4 said they do. And that would have been a good time for Jesus to have corrected the devil. But they're under his control. And of course we know that God's behind everything and control, and they have temporary control, but nevertheless, this is the way it is. I heard a Baptist missionary giving his testimony, how that they were involved, I believe, in Guatemala with the dark occult powers in that whole region, which were withstanding their work. And the leading spirit of that whole region that was in charge of all the sorcery, witchcraft, and occultism, who controlled the area, you know, he was in control of the spirits of divination that work through the mediums and that sort of thing. So you'll have a lieutenant or a prince who will be over everything. He has his throne. And if God would open your eyes to the invisible realm, you just see them seated there and sending out their agents and lieutenants and whatever. So to make a long story short, this prince who was over this whole geographical region took possession of a youth there, and all sorts of fantastic things took place, you know, like floating in the air and the whole business. And so they fasted, and somehow, through a pastor there or something, they brought the youth to him. It was such a weird case. And they didn't know what was possessing him, but being charismatic, they knew about evil spirits. And in commanding the spirit to name itself, it wouldn't come out. And it said, the reason you can't cast me out, he said, I broke your fast 3 days ago. They had elected to fast to cast the spirit out, and he had made them so hungry that some made a little broth, and they ate that. Said, well, that's still a fast. And the demon just laughed at them because they broke their fast. No, Jesus said some come out only by prayer and fasting. Well, demons that are over Persia are, can we say it, Atlanta or Chicago or Washington, whatever. They're powerful. You don't just get them out always by saying go. The demon gave its name and admitted that it was in charge of all the witchcraft. And they bound the spirit in the boy, said, you can't cast me out. They said, then we bind you in him, so you can't come out. which they did. And he tried to get out and couldn't because he was free to come and go. You know, spirits can come and go. They don't just always stay in a person who are possessed by him. And since he was the leading spirit, you see, he'd possess this boy and get whatever work he wanted to do through the boy. Then he'd go somewhere else and possess somebody else or whatever. And so they bound him in there for 10 days. All of this is on tape. It's fantastic. And so finally he was begging and pleading, because for a demon not to be able to get out is as bad as not to be able to get in. He was in torments. And so finally he said, if you'll let me out, I'll shut down all the occult in Guatemala, or whatever this region was. And I'm pretty sure it was Guatemala. And so of course they wouldn't bargain with the devil. But they had him bound in there, but he said he wasn't coming out. Then they cast him out because he wanted out so bad, and they said overnight, every center of witchcraft closed down in the whole geographical area. So demon powers, where are they? We said the sphere of their existence. Well, they're in control of governments and educational institutions and medical institutions, Hollywood institutions, banking institutions. They are literally in control. And one day, while that sounds very foolish, maybe even to some charismatics, I don't know, but one day we'll be proven to be right. Another place they dwell at present, their habitat, is desolated ruins and the desert. Desolated ruins are the desert. Jesus called them dry places. That's the passages we gave you before. We'll look at them now. Isaiah 13, 19 to 21. Isaiah 34, 14. Isaiah 13, 19 to 21. And then Isaiah 34, 14. Isaiah 13, 19, 21. In Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldees, excellency, shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. And it shall never be inhabited, neither shall it be dwelt in from generation to generation. Neither shall the Arabian pitch tent there, neither shall the shepherds make their fold there, but wild beasts of the desert shall lie there, and their houses shall be full of doleful creatures, and owls shall dwell there, and satyrs shall dance there. Now that word for satyr is one of the demons that we'll mention later, because some of them have names or terms used in the Old Testament. But that's the term that we'll give you later, Sa'ir, but we'll wait till we get to it. But satyrs will dwell there. In other words, their dwelling place is in the ruins of ancient civilizations and cities. Keep in mind that when we turn over to Isaiah 34:14, where God says it again. And of course, if you know Babylon, not only is it ruins, but a desert. In fact, it had to be excavated even to find the ruins. The desert had covered it up. Isaiah 34:14. The wild beasts of the desert shall also meet with the wild beasts of the island, and the satyr, that's that same term again, the satyr shall cry to his fellow. The screech owl, and I don't know why they ever translated screech owl, but that's another name for a demon. And the screech owl also shall rest there and find for herself a place of rest. So the satyr and screech owl, by the way, NASV, did they do any better?
Night monster.
Night monster, well, that's better than screech owl. I don't know, maybe the English thought screech owls were demonic, but this is Lidit, screech owl. Now what connection between the female night demon, and they call her a night monster, which is not a lot of help, but it's a little better than screech owl. But when we get to the terms, you'll see these things called satyrs and screech owls and so forth in King James are really demons that have names and are still common today. Now if you take that with Matthew 12:43, where Jesus said, when a demon is cast out, it seeks rest and finds none, it must walk through dry places. It helps you to understand what he had reference to, because these ancient ruins over there in the desert regions would become habitats of wild beasts and unclean spirits. Now this is not a figure of speech from what Jesus said. Have you ever wondered why they'd walk through dry places? This is what he had reference to, you see, the desert and desolated places that have become ruins, that have turned to dust. So when you take your trips to the Near East and wherever you go, and you walk around those ancient ruins of Athens, the temples, and in Egypt, the pyramids, and if you get over to Babylon, where they've done some excavation, in Jericho, that wicked city, these are habitats of demons, so you want to keep yourself covered with the blood. These are not figures of speech. I mean, you shouldn't have to be argued into the fact that that would be a good place where you might find things that are evil. Those degraded, unregenerate civilizations that were just swarming like flies, swarming with demons. So after the civilization fell, they stayed. And then another place where you find them at present is in people. In people, or in close connection with people, to oppress, bind, influence, and control, either in them or oppressing them. For example, Mark 1:23, we read of a man in the synagogue with an unclean spirit. Mark 1:23, a man with an unclean spirit. That means he was possessed. And then in Luke 4:38, Jesus rebuked a fever, which means Peter's mother-in-law was oppressed by a spirit because, as we've said before, fevers can't hear you. That's just a word, F-E-V-E-R, but spirits causing it can. So if it was just healing, Jesus could have laid his hand on her head and said, be healed of that fever, but he rebuked a fever. Significant. So their habitat at present is in people or oppressing people. A man with an unclean spirit, Mark 1:23. And they just may be in the pit also. I won't say that this is absolute, but I suspect they're in the pit and can get in and out at present. I don't know about the getting out, but I'll say that they're in the pit. Luke 8:30-31 with Revelation 9:1-11. Luke 8:30-31 with Revelation 9:1-11. Now we know they'll be in the pit later. But the implication here is, and I think maybe it's been missed, the implication is that Jesus could have cast them in the pit. If God wanted to rid the world of demons, he could have done that a long time ago. But Luke 8:30-31, and Jesus asked him, saying, what is thy name? This is the Gadarene demoniac possessed man. What is thy name? He said, Legion, because many demons were entered into him, and they besought him that he would not command them to go out into the abyss, or deep if you've got King James, but it's the abyss. The pit, abyss. Deep sounds like the ocean, because that's where they ended up, in the deep, the water. So they didn't mean that. Now, the implication is there they could have been cast there, so who's to say there's not many of them already there for whatever reason? And then over in Revelation, taking with that Revelation 9, you see that during tribulation, they start coming out of the pit, or the abyss, the same term. So how did they get in there, except they're there? Now keep in mind, what's described here is not grasshoppers. These are weird demonic creatures coming out of the pit. Demons, because demons take all sorts of shapes. They take forms of goats, of snakes, of hogs, and just all sorts of weird things that people have told me they've seen and been oppressed by. And the fifth angel sounded, I saw a star fall from heaven upon the earth, and unto him was given the key of the bottomless pit. This is the abyss. And he opened the bottomless pit, and there arose a smoke out of the pit as the smoke of a great furnace, and so on. And there came out of the smoke locusts upon the earth. Unto them was given power, as the scorpions of the earth have power. But notice they're not literal locusts, but demonic creatures. It was commanded them they should not hurt the grass of the earth. See, locusts eat grass. Neither any green thing, neither any tree. That's what locusts eat, literal locusts. But they were only to eat men, that is, hurt them. Those who have not the seal of God in their foreheads. And to them it was given that they should not kill them, but that they should be tormented 5 months. And their torment was as the torment of a scorpion when he striketh a man. In those days men shall seek death, and shall not find it, and they shall desire to die, and death shall flee from them. Now look at the shapes. And the shapes of the locusts were like unto horses prepared unto battle. And on their heads were crowns like gold, and their faces were the faces like men have. And they had hair as women. You know, when I read this, I think of the hippie influence. Faces of men, but hair like women. Well, and their teeth were as the teeth of lions. You ever seen a lion's teeth? I've never seen a locust with teeth like a lion. One of them would crush a locust. And they had breastplates, as were breastplates of iron. The sound of their wings was the sound of chariots of many horses running to battle. And they had tails like to scorpions, and there were stings in their tails, and their power was to hurt men 5 months. And they had a king over them. Locusts don't have kings. They had a king over them, which is the angel of the bottomless pit. Now you know, the devil and his demons. His name in the Hebrew tongue is Abaddon, but in the Greek is Apollyon, which of course means destruction. So they're in the pit. They come out during the Great Tribulation. Now they may be bound there now, I don't know, but it's implied, Luke 8, that Jesus could have cast them there. If he couldn't have, they wouldn't have said, don't do it. Because they knew that he had the power to put them in the pit right away. So the abyss is the abode. We've got about 5 places there where they are at present. Where will they be in the future? Well, during the millennium, they'll be in the abyss. That's where they will be, and they'll be bound up. Wherever the devil is, they're going to be. And according to Isaiah 14, 12 to 15, God said he's going to cast Satan down into the pit, into the abyss. Isaiah 14, 12 to 15. God says to Satan, I'm going to cast you down into the depths of the pit. Now, if you take that with Revelation 20, verses 1 and 2, you'll see there we're told that Satan, the devil, was cast into the pit during the 1,000-year period. And an angel from heaven, having the key of the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand, he laid hold on the dragon, the old serpent, which is the devil and Satan, and bound him 1,000 years. Well, of course, if the devil's there, his kingdom's there, his hosts are there. See, some of the things have to be implied, but obviously the demons wouldn't be out if he's locked up. In that particular case, where they'll be during the millennium, not during the tribulation. We saw chapter 9 where they'll be during tribulation. Then for eternity, where will they be? Demons with the devil will be in the lake of fire. Again, they'll be where the devil is, obviously. He's bound for 1,000 years. Then in verses 7 to 10 of Revelation 20, when the 1,000 years are expired, Satan shall be loosed out of his prison. He shall go out and deceive the nations. And they shall go up against the city of the saints. And fire shall come down from God out of heaven and devour them. And the devil that deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are, and shall be tormented day and night forever and ever. So again, it's implied that if the devil is cast into the lake of fire, the demons are not going to be left around to harass and molest like they do now. Exorcism in the Old Testament. Again, it's implied by the New Testament references before the cross. Matthew 12, Acts 19. We've already looked at those. Exorcism was practiced in Israel. It's implied in the New Testament passages before the cross. Matthew 12, Acts 19. Secondly, Josephus mentions how that Solomon practiced exorcism. I don't know how he knew, but he's reliable on some things he may not be. But it would have to be Jewish tradition or Josephus couldn't have gotten away with it. He said Solomon practiced exorcism. He was the wisest man on earth and he knew how to cast out demons, is what Josephus said. The rabbinical literature deals with the practice of exorcism. The literature of the rabbis, rabbinical literature, deals with this fact. Well, what we've already said, the fact that Jesus didn't teach them how to practice exorcism, just told them to go do it, is evidence that it was not uncommon. Protection against Satan and evil spirits is implied in the use of the blood in the Old Testament. Just like we use the blood in the New, it's implied in Exodus 12 when they put it over the doorposts, because there they were protecting themselves against evil spirits. Now, the death angel, to the person who doesn't know enough about the Bible to know that God isn't in the business of death, I suppose Many, many people think that was God down there killing all those firstborn. It wasn't he down there lying to Ahab. The devil is more than willing and anxious to do that kind of work. So in Psalm 78, verses 48 to 51, we see just who was busy in Egypt during those 10 plagues. It wasn't God down there. God's in control. He sent the plagues. But he doesn't have any plagues up in heaven. The devil has the plague. He has the disease. And so maybe this will be some enlightening news for somebody here tonight. 78, 48 to 51. Now he's speaking here about the 10 plagues, so we'll just read at verse 48. He gave up their cattle also to the hail, and their flocks to hot thunderbolts. He cast upon them, meaning God, the fierceness of his anger, wrath and indignation and trouble by sending evil angels among them. Now you read the whole psalm, you see he's talking about the 10 plagues in Egypt. God sent evil angels among them. He made a way to his anger. He spared not their soul from death, but gave their life over to pestilence, and smote all the firstborn in Egypt, the chief of their strength, in the tabernacles of Ham. And so the death angel that went through there, these were evil angels. Well, I suppose a lot of people sing songs even without thinking about what they're saying. They're not always based on good theology. When I see the blood, I will pass over you. That's taken right out of Exodus 12. But see, God is behind sending the evil angels to destroy the firstborn. And so God is not oblivious to what's going on. So he says, when I see the blood, I will pass over you, in the sense that I will not allow this evil angel to destroy your firstborn. So I would assume the more pious Israelites at least could put two and two together. If we charismatics can, they certainly could, and say, look how that blood protected us. And the blood constantly before them in the offerings, how it covered and protected them from disease and everything. They would see a connection. And so in the New Testament, we use the blood to protect us, of course. Where did we get that idea? For the same reason. Exodus 12 is a good place to start if you want to know why we plead the blood, cover ourselves with the blood. And then we see in the Old Testament a distinction between the methods the heathen used to protect themselves from evil spirits and what God allowed Israel to do. Again, it's implied, but the implications are all too clear. The Old Testament had laws against any sort of incantation or magic rites to appease the demons or the other gods, which were demons, Paul said. They had laws against any sort of an appeal to other spirits or gods. But heathenism then and today, and see, God was weaning them away from that. Heathenism uses certain magical rites to invoke the demons, to leave them alone, or to protect themselves from them. See, there's a whole magic ritual, an incantation, and a drawing of the magic circle that's practiced by the witches' covens and so on. And these dark powers, you see, can harm them, and so they appease them, make offerings to them, and so on. And so Israel had prohibitions against magic and incantations and contact with these dark powers. And so they would appeal to God. There again, by implication, like we appeal to Jesus, they would appeal to Yahweh. Because when Jesus came along in Mark 16:17 and said, in my name you shall cast out demons. Well, certainly any Israelite would have been casting out who practiced exorcism. Not demons in his own power or his own name, but he would be invoking the name of deity. Some of these things, I say, are implied, but the very fact that we have prohibitions against the ways that the heathen appeased and protected themselves. The Israelites had prohibitions against it, means that they had appealed to another way, and that's to the Lord.